everyone, and welcome back to my spoiler review for The War Between Land and Sea, episodes 1 and 2. I decided to do this as kind of a collective video rather than splitting them up, because obviously I imagine that as soon as everyone's watched episode 1, they're immediately going to watch episode 2, so that seemed to make sense to me to just wait until both were out before doing my video. But obviously, I'm recording this the day after I've seen it, at the screening, which I mentioned last week. So obviously, bear in mind that I myself, only seen it once, and obviously I saw it in a cinema as well. So obviously, I was kind of swept up in the mood of it. But I have made some notes, and I wanted to give my kind of thoughts on this. So I'm going to try and separate this into episodes 1 and 2, but because obviously I watched both of them at the same time, and so will you guys. Theoretically, there might be moments where I kind of cover both or have points that apply to both episodes. But starting off, one of the things I wanted to say, and it echoes something I said in my spoiler-free review, is, again, the visuals of this just look immediately incredible. The first sort of scene we get is a fisherman taking down a sea devil, killing a sea devil off of the Mediterranean Sea, and, UNIT are basically brought in to take a look at it and essentially cover it up, because they don't want the humans to know that the sea devils live down there, or that Homo Aqua live down there. So they don't want it to cause a mass panic, essentially. So whenever evidence of sea devils kind of emerges, they kind of just brush it aside in fear of basically not causing a worldwide panic. But of course, the sea devils are incredibly unhappy with one of their kind being shot by one of these sailors. So when the body is being held by a unit, the floor opens up and they basically take their friend away from them. And this scene reminded me very much of the scenes in series 5 with the Silurians grabbing people from under the ground as well. Obviously, only in this case, it reveals a bunch of water beneath them. So I'm wondering if that was a deliberate choice to kind of evoke similar kind of technologies as the Silurians have, because obviously they're sister species, so that made sense. Talking of sister species, one of the things that I did find interesting is the way that they've handled the evolution of the sea devils in this show. Obviously, sea devils is basically said to be the kind of folk myth version of what we call them as humans. That's what we've been calling them for decades. But of course, that's not their official designation, but neither is Homo Aqua. Homo Aqua is kind of the simplified version that the general kind of ascribes to them, because that's what they look like. You've got basically 3 main versions of this species that you see in this show. You've got the Homo erispondyls, I believe that they're called. Apologies if my pronunciation of any of the scientific names is completely botched. I'm not, particularly a biology person, but hopefully that was correct. Which are kind of your main sea devils. Obviously, they look probably the most similar to the classic sea devil while also being kind of updated. Obviously, they speak via kind of screams, basically. They have the kind of their own language and their own way of communicating. And they're kind of these big, more kind of reptilian fish-like kind of creatures. But then you've also got, I can't remember what the official name for it was, they did say, but Shirley basically says big fish, which is one of the other evolutions, is just a giant fish, which I just thought was kind of funny. I wasn't expecting it when they said, oh, there's 3 different versions of the species, or there's 3 different, life forms coming through, 3 different types of life form. I was like, well, hang on, I know that there's obviously the main ones and the Goo one, the salt character, who seems different from the others. Who's this third one? And then the third one comes out and it's just a giant fish, which I just thought was, I was very taken aback by that. I was like, wow, okay. So I really actually quite liked the evolution of the mythos there. And I liked that they did give an explanation as to why, they are different from your original sea devils. I think there's a line in it as well where they're talking about them, where they say they originally called sea devils, but they've evolved much more beyond that. So it's kind of implied that this is the next evolutions of the sea devil chain, which is kind of something that I speculated in one of my videos talking about one of the short trailers that was released. And this is kind of exemplified in Salt, Gugu's character, who is Homo amphibia. who herself is probably the most advanced of all of them. Interestingly, she's the only one who can speak English and various other human languages. We get a scene of her speaking Russian to the original ambassador, which is interesting because obviously in like Legends of the Sea Devils, they can speak English to a certain extent. But what's interesting about her is that she seems to be kind of the leader, but also kind of like, she seems to be the one that like leads all the communication among the Sea Devils. Like when she breathes, they all seem to breathe, and she kind of almost seems to be what I would probably describe as like the queen bee in essence, like the sort of leader one, the most advanced, you know, the one that basically the others are basically followers and she is basically the commander. That's the vibe I get, at least. And then through all of this, you've got obviously Barkley, who, as I said in my spoiler-free video, is kind of the central kind of figurehead at the center of this plot, unwillingly. Like obviously it's said in episode 1 that he is basically a temp unit. He effectively, you know, he orders the taxis for the various, you know, members of unit, and he gets the coffees. That's what he does at unit. But when he originally had to fill in for someone called Roger Trethik, I think his name is, he was always kept on their lists and in their filing as Roger's replacement. So when Roger goes absent again, he gets sent on this mission to the Mediterranean to recover this Sea Devil. But of course, you know, he gets a lot more than he bargained for. You know, he sees the people die because the Sea Devils take them away after their Sea Devil is killed. So this then causes the first diplomatic talks between Homo Aqua and humanity to happen. They basically get the general out at the Mediterranean, who is played by Colin McFarlane, the General Austin Pierce, who you've also seen in Torchwood, who, by the way, can I just say, I absolutely love his voice in this. It's so, like, authoritative and commanding. But they basically get this, like, giant translation system out, and they're basically like, look, some of your guys have been killed, some of my guys have been killed, we want peace. And, you know, we want to be able to talk with you and create, like, a peace. And the Sea Devils, you know, obviously they respond in their own language, and obviously there's a live translation thing, which I think is really cool. But they kind of say that we want to be seen by all of you. And so they come out from the earth and reveal themselves across the world, not just to these soldiers who are negotiating with them initially. And then there's just this wonderful shot of all of these, you know, kind of coral reefs kind of emerging out from the ocean with the Sea Devils all stood atop them. And naturally, this causes the entirety of humanity to go into absolute meltdown, like, what the hell's going on? And naturally, you know, this causes like a major international incident. Like, obviously, UNIT is placed at the center of something that's called the H2O Committee, which is basically something that's leading the negotiations with Homo Aqua and is kind of corresponding with all the different world leaders to kind of try and, you know, collectively work in the greatest interest of humanity. But naturally, humans are selfish and we all have our own kind of motivations as well. So they build this kind of like conference room in the middle of London and this kind of aqueduct type thing that the Sea Devils can come through to kind of negotiate with humanity. And this is where it gets interesting because obviously humanity selects out someone who is very much like kind of a traditional politician type. I think he's a sir as well. So, you know, he's quite an esteemed man and he's seen as like the best voice for humanity. But the Sea Devils go, I don't know this guy, I want that one. And they point to Barkley, which leads to, you know, the great comedic moment of me. And the reason for this is quite interesting because they say that he paid respect to their fallen kin, basically, because he did the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit kind of thing, which is something a lot of people do when they see something kind of like, you know, extraordinary or overwhelming. They saw that as a sign of respect. So they want him to lead the negotiations with the Sea Devils because obviously they don't know anyone else, but they see him as respectful to their kind, which I thought was actually a really cool way of getting him into the plot. And I mean, it leads to a very funny line of dialogue where Kate is like, what, they're Christians now? Like, I thought that was really funny. And as I said, like I said this in the spoiler-free video, like there's a lot of lines of dialogue in this that are just so funny to me. Like obviously Barkley's family, who I haven't touched on much, but they are very central to him. They are, you know, something that means a lot to him. Obviously, he's got an ex-wife and a daughter who he sees kind of like every other weekend, like a lot of divorced kind of families do. But obviously, you know, he starts saying that, you know, once this stuff starts happening that, oh, I can't take her this time and that time. And so on and so forth, because obviously the stuff's going on. Initially as well, he doesn't tell them like what his job is. He kind of just says that he's like, you know, he works in an office, which isn't untrue, but of course, you know, when your office place is unit, you know, stuff can happen. So eventually, you know, because he has chosen to lead these negotiations, they all find out that, oh my God, you know, he's actually going to be the one in charge of this, like one of the biggest, you know, sort of international moments of our time. And his family's life changes as a result of that. You know, his daughter and ex-wife are basically sent into protective custody alongside Barkley. And at this moment, we get some more really funny lines of dialogue. Like, I particularly love the line of dialogue from his ex-wife saying, listen, one minute I'm being told that my, you know, ex-husband works at like an office. The next minute, he's the savior of humanity. I'm going to take as much from the bar as I want. And he's like, I don't think that bar is free. You know, stuff like that I just thought was really good. And I mean, I said, I think in the spoiler-free video that this reminded me of what I liked about Russell's work. And I think this very much does. Like, the human element at the heart of this is really what brings it all together. Obviously, I spent a lot of time talking initially about the Homo Aqua because I love, you know, the monsters of Doctor Who, and I think visually they look fantastic. But the heart of the story really is Barkley, the effects it has on him as a person and his family, and also the way that he kind of speaks on behalf of humanity, because initially he gets given a very kind of cookie cutter, kind of politician-esque kind of script to read from the UN and obviously UNIT, which makes sense. You know, they don't want this big international event to turn into a crisis, so they give him, you know, kind of a very, very milquetoast kind of speech to say, you know, we're aware of all the pollution, and obviously you get that brilliant scene where the Sea Devil goes, I'd like some river water, but not for me. You should drink it. And he basically goes, I can't drink it. We are aware of the crisis. And then the Sea Devil basically goes, these are the words of a politician, shallow. What do you think? And he basically goes on and says, I think we were stupid. We've spent all this time dumping stuff into our rivers and, you know, factories and smoke and all of this sort of stuff. We didn't stop and think about, you know, the consequences of it. We realize now, but is it too late? And I thought that scene was really good. And I loved kind of the stuff talking about how maybe it's time a normal person actually got to kind of, you know, interpret this, because obviously we're so used to, I think, as like a society, politicians dictating things who basically just give us endless like word salads. I think that's very much true in the UK, where you'll ask them a question and they'll kind of just give you variations of a pre-prepared script, which is what Barkley is initially forced into. But of course, he goes rogue on a number of occasions and kind of speaks from the heart, which initially, you know, leads him to receiving much praise, but also backlash as well, because underneath all of this, obviously you've got UNIT, who are obviously trying their best to just broker peace in any way they can, but also then you've got the government, obviously the Prime Minister is in this as well, and obviously, you know, doesn't want anything to go wrong for his like net popularity and stuff like that, and obviously all the other world leaders as well. But obviously underneath all of that, you've got the vested business interests as well. Obviously, Barkley is basically saying, oh, I think we can get a 50% reduction in like the waste by like 2065. And the Sea Devil's like, well, that's not good enough. And obviously, these companies that profit from pollution and they profit from all of these practices that the Sea Devils oppose and obviously makes their life, you know, terrible, obviously are lobbying for the minimum amount of like, you know, regulation possible, or the minimum amount of stuff that they have to do as well. Because obviously you get that scene where the military meet up with someone who is the Prime Minister's biggest donor, who's basically like, he will have to listen to me, I'm his biggest donor, and the main thing I care about is my companies. And obviously that's different from UNIT, who just want, you know, peace at any means, whereas with these guys, obviously, they're trying to undermine UNIT because they kind of think, well, you know, they're being too nice to the Sea Devils, or they're being too accommodating to them. But of course, as the point is made early on in episode 1, they were here first. So it's kind of a dilemma, right? The other thing I found interesting was, obviously, still on episode 1 here, the amount of little nods and Easter eggs to Doctor Who we get. Obviously, I believe this was on the cast list, but Trinity Wells appears once again as an American newscaster, which I always love. But also, Barkley himself says that he briefly met the Doctor at the Tower of London a few years ago, and it was a very brief encounter, but he said that like it was incredibly vivid, and it kind of changed him in some kind of way. And I thought that was really interesting. I wasn't expecting them to directly reference the Doctor, but I believe they reference him twice. Once, like I said, when Barkley is talking about, you know, having met him to a unit soldier, and the other time when Barkley goes off script and Kate basically said, oh god, it's like working with the Doctor. So that kind of leans into what I was saying in my spoiler-free video, like where you don't really have to have watched Doctor Who to get it, but obviously it adds an extra layer if you have. The other thing I found interesting was Albion making reappearances across these two episodes. Albion, obviously, for those of you who don't remember, is the party of Roderick William in 73 Yards, who kind of lead the UK into kind of that vaguely kind of authoritarian direction with, like, you know, them wanting to like launch nukes and stuff like that. So it's interesting that they still exist in our universe, but obviously are a lot less powerful at this current point than they were in the 73 Yards timeline. But it's interesting how they are basically saying, you know, we need to go to war with Homo Aqua, which leads me into kind of episode 2, which is the plastic apocalypse. And boy oh boy, is that a fitting name for this episode. Because essentially, after they choose Barkley to be the ambassador in episode 1, episode 2 basically follows the fallout from that. Initially, they, you know, the humans really don't want him to be because he's just a random guy. But initially, they have to concede, and that leads to a lot of the kind of pre-prepared sort of speeches and him eventually going rogue and stuff. But of course, initially, that wins him much plaudits when he basically says, you know, that we were stupid, these companies have done things to us, and, you know, we've got kids as well, and we don't want this kind of thing. And that gets a lot of praise from people. But then, you know, he is told to go back onto script for the next meeting, and the next meeting tells them, you know, how much plastic they can remove. The Sea Devil says, you know, that's not good enough. And then she says, how much do you really want to solve this crisis? And he says, it is our greatest desire. So then she goes, all right, well, I'm going to give you your greatest desire. And then the Sea Devils basically throw all the plastic that has been dumped out into the oceans back onto land, which obviously creates a massive emergency because obviously metric tons of plastic are being dropped onto the populace of Earth. Barkley's family almost die, you know, or they are very close to dying. You know, the taxi driver that's taking them away dies, and it's kind of this big oh my god moment. But of course, from the Sea Devil's perspective, it makes sense because they're like, well, you put this all in our domain, so we're going to give it all back to you. But obviously, people like Albion see it as this is a declaration of war. This is a direct, you know, declaration of war between our species. And the general also says that it's like, this is a call to war kind of thing, which I don't think they necessarily thought of it as, the Sea Devils themselves. But of course, the Sea Devils have demands that humanity just sees as insane and, you know, they cannot realistically enforce. Because before Salt announces that she's giving all the plastic back, she basically goes, we've got 3 demands, basically. Removing all the plastic, territorial borders for the ocean, so essentially, you know, they get their own designated spaces. Humanity offers them a smaller kind of reservation area, and they're like, no, the oceans are ours. Like, you can have the land, but the ocean is ours, and also we don't want you flying across the ocean either, which I thought, oh, I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, technically, if the water is theirs, then any flight going across there would have to, you know, be agreed by them. But obviously, all of the international, you know, kind of ambassadors are like, well, hang on a minute. International trade relies upon us being able to, you know, transport across the waters. How on earth are we supposed to, like, function as a modern world with that? And then the other thing they say, last of all, is for continued negotiations to happen, we have met you in your domain twice. For the next one, we want to meet you at our domain, which is obviously under the water, which leads us into the cliffhanger at the end of episode 2. And that's one thing I want to point out as well. The cliffhangers in this show are very, very good. Like, they're very, very kind of like classic Doctor Who-y cliffhangers. Obviously, the first one is them proclaiming that Barkley should be their ambassador. The second one is obviously them announcing that the next meeting needs to take place at their domain, which leads us into episode 3, which would presumably be us going into kind of the Sea Devils, like, habitat and where they live and stuff, which is going to be very interesting. Other things I wanted to know. Colonel Ibrahim and Kate. I think this is probably going to be talked about a lot on Doctor Who Twitter, I imagine. But of course, it's been implied for a while that her and Colonel Ibrahim have kind of a relationship. And this is kind of the most explicit view of that. Obviously, we see them kind of you know, comforting each other. And basically, you know, when I was watching it, I was kind of like, oh, are we supposed to be seeing as much of this as we are? Because it's very intimate. And it's also something I'm used to seeing in Doctor Who these days. So I was kind of like, oh, okay, interesting. But it seems as well like the rest of UNIT don't know, because I noticed that following day that Kate and Ibrahim arrived separately. So it kind of implies to me that they're still keeping up like a professional appearance to everyone else, but obviously they do have a relationship kind of, but it's kind of secret in a sense. There's also kind of, speaking of romance, kind of a flicker of something between Barkley and the Sea Devil, which I'm sure will be expanded upon, which I think has been implied in like several interviews before as well. Obviously you get that great line from his ex-wife where he says, well, she's kind of beautiful, and his ex-wife goes, she's a fish, you know. And then in episode 2 they ask like, oh, are you jealous? And the daughter basically goes, yeah, she is jealous. And that's interesting. When she compliments him and kind of says, you know, oh, you're my favorite human, he sort of like cheekily laughs, almost like he's being, you know, flirted with, and everyone around him is just giving him the blankest stare ever, because they're like, you know, focus please, you know, this is a big event going on. Another interesting thing is that UNIT basically cut out the French ambassador, mainly because I believe they released Barkley's identity before they wanted to. They leaked it to the press in advance, which obviously caused, you know, a mass panic, especially because Barkley works for UNIT, so it was kind of seen as, oh, right, well, UNIT's leading this, and now they've got someone who works for them, you know, leading the negotiations, how convenient for them kind of thing. But eventually the French ambassador does get led back in, so I'm imagining she's going to come back and kind of play a role in the proceedings going forward. Maybe she's going to be kind of, you know, maybe like a thorn in the side of UNIT and their negotiations. Maybe she'll side with the business tycoons and entrepreneurs. And you've also got as well a scientist character who basically gives Homo aqua tissue samples to the military and to you know, big business as well. So you've got all these kind of different factions coming in to kind of work for their own sides, essentially. You've got UNIT, who's just trying to find peace. Barkley, who is being told all these different things, but who himself has his own beliefs and, you know, isn't going to just be told, say this, say that. But then you've also got, you know, capital and business interests and government and political interests as well. So there's a lot of layers to it, and I really did enjoy this. This is more in the vein of what I was imagining from RTD2 when we saw it, because obviously a lot of people talk about Doctor Who being too political, and I've never really bought into that. I think political stories are important, and if they're done well, they can be really interesting. And I mean, I think what's interesting about this show is that this is how we would react. I think what's interesting to me is that the way I would describe this show is kind of like Torchwood Children of Earth, except unlike the 456, who are just like evil, you know, they're just completely evil. What they want to do to children is unambiguously horrific, but humanity almost goes along with it. And initially, you know, in the first instance, Jack does go along with it. With the Sea Devils and with Homo Aqua, they kind of have a point. Like, obviously, some of their demands might be seen as a bit, you know, out there by the humans, but from their perspective, they have a point. You know, they were here first, and they're willing to let, you know, humanity keep the land. That's theirs. That's what they evolved to live on. But the seas are theirs. So, obviously, in this show, it's much more implied that humanity are the monsters, which is also kind of true of Children of Earth as well. But the difference then was that the 456 was, like, terrifying and horrifically evil as well. Whereas with this, like, the Sea Devil's, you know, cause is a valid one, which you're supposed to sympathize with, and I think it does do that very effectively. Something else I want to mention is, like, some of the other funny moments that I just really liked. For example, when the Titanic is thrown back up to Earth, onto New York after its voyage, and you get a conference saying, you know, 80 years after its maiden voyage, or however long it's been, 100 years, the Titanic has re-emerged from under the ocean after all this time, which got a big laugh in my theatre as well, and I thought that was really funny. They did a really good job of making the plastic kind of coming out of the ocean feel like, you know, real and not going too crazy with it. Obviously, you get a scene where, like, a tire, like, flings towards Barkley's daughter, and, like, a giant, like, anchor, you know, almost falls onto them as well. But, like, it doesn't feel too cartoony. Like, it feels pretty authentic, but also the destruction feels real enough as well. Like, it doesn't feel like, oh, this is just affecting one tiny area. You do get wide shots of plastic being absolutely everywhere, which obviously I imagine is being done through a blend of CGI and practical effects. And that's something I really wanted to point out as well. The blend of this show of the CGI and the practical, I think, looks really, really good. There's like some shots in this that I want to point out that I just think are absolutely fantastic. The one that particularly got me was in episode 1 where the Sea Devil is hanging up in that kind of shed, and just the rays of light kind of casting onto its body and the kind of shot of it from below just looks so good. Like, the way that the shots are composed in this, the color grade, it just looks so fantastic. It's edited to be really smooth as well. And as I said in my spoiler-free video, Lorne Balf's score is very, very good as well. So those are my thoughts, spoilery thoughts, on episode 1 and 2 of The War Between Land and Sea. Again, if I had any major criticism, I mentioned this kind of in my spoiler-free video as well, but I think the pacing of the first 10 minutes of the first episode, you know, maybe it takes a little bit of time to get going, but once you're in, you are in. I can imagine there'll probably be some complaints saying that the environmental message maybe comes across as potentially a little bit heavy-handed, but honestly, I would argue that given the subject matter, it makes sense that it would be. Like, these conversations make sense that they would be happening given the context of the story. It's not like it's just thrown in there because, like, the idea of the Sea Devils and the environment has, you know, been something that's been connected for a very long time, and it makes complete sense to me for that to be connected in this way in this story. Just before I forget, we also get introduced to another new unit character who's played by, I believe he plays Isaac in Sex Education, which was a fun little surprise. I was like, oh, he's like another scientist type alongside Shirley as well. So that was very cool. Let me know what you guys think. Subscribe if you're new. I'll be appreciated. And I will see you later.